This video contains testimony and statements already in evidence. As well, this video contains testimony and statements from Kevin Salisbury. This is Kevin Salisbury, Dan Searle's nephew. This is Dan Searles, the alleged victim, and the uncle of Kevin Salisbury. Kevin Salisbury lived in the same house as Dan Searles months prior and months after the event between Dan and Chris. While Kevin is Dan's relation, Kevin realizes that Dan is wrong for what he did to Chris that night, and as you will hear, he states he has no reason to lie. In deposition, Dan Searles admits Kevin Salisbury does in fact live in the same house as himself. Let's listen.
Who's the nephew that lives with you?
Kevin.
Kevin what?
Kevin Salisbury.
Who's the nephew that lives with you?
Kevin.
Kevin what?
Kevin Salisbury.
Dan Searles that night in his official statement to the sheriffs stated that he had Chris blinded and that he could have and should have just left.
The insecticide, where did you spray him at the face?
Yeah.
What happened when he did that?
He started whipping that pipe around pretty bad.
Okay.
I should have just gotten out of there then, because I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done. But
Okay.
Here Dan asserts that Chris had a pipe. Chris in fact had no weapon of any kind on him when he first approached Dan. When Dan said Chris was whipping a pipe around, Chris was actually covering his face and eyes with both hands from the spray. Dan told many, many lies about what did happen that night, and Chris approaching him with a pipe is just one of the many. What's known is, according to Dan, Chris was blinded, and that he could and should have left, but Dan did not want to leave, really. Let's listen.
because I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done. But because I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done. But that's what I probably should have done. But
That night to sheriffs, Dan clearly admits that the toxic bee killer that he sprayed into Chris's face had a blinding effect on him. Dan admits as well that this blinding of Chris gave him a chance to get the heck out of there, had he really wanted to. But the truth is that Dan never wanted to leave. What Dan did do, and later in deposition was forced to admit, was he then clubbed a blinded Chris's head. Yet later on in deposition, Dan changes his story and then states the spray had zero effect, as the very reasoning why he used the club on Chris's head. Dan as well in deposition is forced to acknowledge that he struck Chris after the spray and before he was ever struck himself. Chris attempted to retreat, but Dan would strike at the back of his head. Chris had no choice but to charge Dan and wrestle the club from him. Now let's listen to Kevin Salisbury, the nephew of Dan, who was present as Dan explained what really happened that night. Let's listen. What's up, Kevin Salisbury?
What's up?
So, if you why didn't you fucking listen to that? Well, that's my testimony.
What I was charged with, Dan said I just grabbed him and started beating on him. He made no mention of beating me with a club.
Yeah.
He hid that.
Well,
Then he had to admit
of course he had to hide that
because he would have been charged with assault.
with an assault, yeah.
And that dumbass actually said to the police, after I sprayed him,
Yeah.
he was blind. I could have got out of there. I should have. He even
That's
admitted
what he should have did.
But you know what he did
Instead
instead?
of New Hampshire, he'd go to jail just for spraying you in the face, dude.
But you know what he
That's a chemical weapon.
But
That's
you know what he did instead of leaving?
He stuck around and wanted to fucking hit you.
Yeah,
one,
he grabbed
one
the
or two
club
more
when
fucking times.
When I was blind.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it did. Didn't he say
That's
that
what
to
it
you?
is. Yeah,
Didn't he say
he
that?
mentioned something about it. Toby was there, Toby's girlfriend was there, my aunt was there. You know, everybody was sitting there, and Dan was all fucked up. And Val's going, oh my God, what the fuck? He's trying to kill, I'm going to go talk to him right now.
And he almost killed me with that club. You know
Yeah,
that, right?
he could have killed you very easily, dude. That's no fucking joke, dude. I hit someone in the eye right there. That could cause stroke, fucking blindness. this.
He could have killed me.
Fucking death.
Yeah, I didn't.
From hitting right there in the eye right there where he nailed you?
I didn't.
That's bad shit.
I didn't
right
come
there.
at Dan violently. He's the one who sprayed me and started.
No, he's all in fear because he knows he's been fucking pissing you off. Right here.
I'll turn around.
But yeah, man, I mean, yeah, he knows he's been pissing you off, and now he's like, oh, fuck. Dude's way bigger than me and shit. Oh, man.
He's so
I gotta make the first strike.
But didn't Dan say to you something like? Yeah, I remember you told me before something about Dan's only regret is that he hit me one too many times and it forced me to charge at him.
Or something about he should have got out of there and he just wanted to whack you one more time just to let you know that he got the best of you or some shit. It was on the lines of that he knew, but he knew he should have got out of there after, but he just wanted to get you one more time or something like that. That's what how he put it.
Yeah.
In so many words or whatever.
And honestly,
And I have no reason to lie, dude. So if you're wide and you fucking listen to that, well, that's my testimony.
Kevin Salisbury states that Dan Searles admitted to him, Dan's sister Val, Toby, and Toby's girlfriend that he could have gotten out of there. Also that Dan's reasoning for not getting out of there was that he was busy striking Chris with the club and wanted to hit him more and more. After blinding Chris and splitting his head open with the club, Dan simply wanted to damage him more and felt Chris was unable to fend him off. And Dan's very reasoning for not stopping striking was that he was making sure Chris knew Dan had got the better of him. Kevin Salisbury states as well that Dan fully intended to strike first, because he had been pissing Chris off. For months, Dan had been vandalizing and damaging Chris's vehicle, and is why Chris had him pull over that night to confront him. Verbally. But Dan hid alongside Chris's van, then sprayed him and began to bludgeon him with a club before Chris knew what was happening. Dan was not satisfied with spraying and clubbing Chris to the ground just once. He wanted to club him more and more and more. This is why Dan slips out to sheriffs that he had Chris blinded and could have and should have gotten out of there. And then says, but, let's listen.
I should have just gotten out of there then, because I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done,
But he did not really want to get out of there, and did not. What he wanted to do was seriously injure Chris. Not out of self-defense, but rather out of rage and anger, and a desire to do as much damage to Chris as he could, rather than get out of there, and safely leave. Let's hear as well what Dan stated to sheriffs that night about what happened.
He ran me off the road right here in my golf cart. So I pulled over and he got out and he said, "You're dead, mother effer." And I'll admit, man, I did spray him with bee killer because I was afraid of the guy, man. He's fucking bigger than you know? So I'm a little guy, man. I do admit I did spray him with bee killer because I was afraid for my life. He told me he was going to kill me.
Okay.
All right. And then he grabbed me and he just beat the shit out of me. He bit me in my finger. And then he just beat me in my head with a pipe, man. I just balled up, really. He ran me off the road right here in my golf cart. So I pulled over and he got out and he said, "You're dead, mother effer." And I'll admit, man, I did spray him with bee killer because I was afraid of the guy, man. He's fucking bigger than you know? So I'm a little guy, man. I do admit I did spray him with bee killer because I was afraid for my life. He told me he was going to kill me.
Okay.
All right. And then he grabbed me and he just beat the shit out of me. He bit me in my finger. And then he just beat me in my head with a pipe, man. I just balled up, really.
To the sheriffs that night, Dan made no mention whatsoever of beating Chris's head with a club. Let's see the police report. On the above date and time, Mr. Christopher P. Vangile, arrestee, struck Mr. Daniel Wayne Searles, victim, in the head with a metal pipe 2 or 3 times. Mr. Vangile approached Mr. Searles after running him off the road. Mr. Vangile got out of his vehicle and stated, "You're dead, mother effer," as he came at Mr. Searles. Mr. Searles feared for his life at the time, due to the size and stature of Mr. Vangile. Mr. Vangile grabbed Mr. Searles and threw him to the ground and started beating him with the metal pipe. Chris was charged with exactly what Dan said happened that night. Dan makes no mention that night of clubbing Chris at all. Later in deposition, Dan repeats that same version, that same story, that same lie. Let's listen.
Just asking you to
Okay.
talk about what happened, okay?
So, yes, I sprayed him with bee killer. I
Okay.
was in fear for my life. He had a steel pipe in his hand, and he's a very large man. He's
Okay.
a lot larger than I am. When I sprayed him in the face,
Okay.
he started waving the steel pipe, and he struck me in the head with it, and he grabbed a hold of me, and he struck me in the head again, and he struck me in the head again, and he struck me in the head again.
Okay, how many times? Because you keep on saying that.
I'd say 4 or 5 times he hit me in the head with a steel pipe.
Okay.
I was down on the ground. The first time he hit me in the head, I grabbed onto the pipe, and I fell to the ground, and I just held onto the pipe with everything I had, because I was bleeding all over the place. And then when he hit me the other 3 or 4 times, I was screaming for help for somebody. Somebody called 911. Please, somebody help me.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess a neighbor had came out and said the police are on their way, and that's when he got up and he left. And I got up and I drove away on my golf cart. I don't know why.
Here at the beginning of the deposition, Dan repeats the same lie he told in his statement that night. Dan again covers up his attacking Chris first. While Dan again covers up his striking Chris, he now makes a few other changes as well. In his first version that he made that night, he asserts he just balled up. Now, in this version, he no longer just balls up, but is grabbing onto a pipe and struggling. As well now, Dan makes no mention of his being bitten. Dan now makes no mention of being bitten, as it will open up a door to the fact he was beating Chris to the point that Chris had to bite his hand to stop it. Here is a police photo of the bite to Dan's hand. It is clearly on the very top of his knuckles, exactly where if he was gripping a club, he would be bitten. Biting Dan's hand was the only way Chris could get him to release the club, the only way to stop Dan's attack. In his police statement that night, as well as at the beginning of his deposition, Dan in both instances covers up and lies about clubbing Chris. We know now that night he said he had Chris blinded, and could and should have left. When counsel questioned Dan in deposition, she first had Dan admit the club in evidence is in fact his, and he did. Counsel then let Dan tell the version we just heard, again which is a repeat of his police statement made that night. Now that counsel first establishes the club is Dan's, then lets him retell that same version he told that night, she now pieces it together. She now catches Dan off guard and forces him to admit to beating Chris with it. Remember, this is after he lies about it first. Not only does counsel force him to admit to using it on Chris, but that he used it after he had sprayed him and before he was ever touched. Also, Dan now admits to striking Chris's upper body repeatedly. While Dan states that night he blinded Chris and could and should have left, he now states the spray didn't work. Even later in deposition, Dan goes so far as to say that the spray had zero effect. Clearly, Dan's now trying to justify his attack. Let's now hear Dan's deposition as he is forced to admit to the attack upon Chris. Again, remember, this is not what he said prior.
Now the walking stick. Did you use that in when you were...
Yes, I did, because the bee killer didn't stop and he was still coming after me.
Okay, why didn't you... Did you tell the police to use a stick?
Yes, I did.
Okay. When did you pick up the stick?
When he was swinging the pipe at me and the bee killer didn't work.
Okay, so after the bee killer, before he actually made contact with you with the pipe?
Yes.
We're going in chronological order here.
Okay.
And then you got the wasp killer, and that's when you sprayed him because of the threats, you said, right?
Correct.
And that's also when you struck him with the stick.
Correct.
Okay.
Because the bee killer had, like, 0 effect on him.
We're going in chronological order here.
Okay.
And then you got the wasp killer, and that's when you sprayed him because of the threats, you said, right?
Correct.
And that's also when you struck him with the stick.
Correct.
Okay.
Because the bee killer had, like, 0 effect on him.
That night when Dan was interviewed, he said the bee killer had Chris blinded. Now Dan states it had 0 effect. Clearly Dan is lying greatly. What is most notable is that every time Dan changes his story, it does not go off in a third direction. It goes in the direction of the version Chris told. Dan states now he did what he did to Chris because Chris yelled at him that night, "You're dead, mother effer," as he approached him, and was afraid. This is also a lie that Dan repeats over and over again. The eyewitness Deidre only saw the very end when after Chris was forced to defend himself. But Deidre, the witness, was sitting on her outside porch the entire time and heard clearly the entire event from the very beginning to the very end. Deidre states the first thing she heard was agitated speech that was in distress and sounded as if they had a speech impediment. Then, right after, she heard what sounded to her like a person being hit with a bat. What Deidre heard is identical to what Chris stated happened. That is, he approached Dan, who just sprayed him before he could say a single word. The distressed, impeded speech was from Chris, who was covering his face with both hands and demanding Dan stop spraying him as he crouched and covered up. The bat sound Deidre heard was Dan striking a blinded, cowering Chris in his skull, sending him to the ground and out for a brief second or two. If Deidre could hear and discern accurately all that she did from Chris, who was covering his mouth and making those distressed, impeded sounds, she would have most certainly and clearly heard what Dan stated Chris said at that very moment of, "You're dead, mother effer." But she did not hear that. She did not hear that because Chris never said that. She heard Chris's impeded speech and then him being clubbed in his skull. Dan knew he had to lie about this language to try to justify his spraying and clubbing Chris, which remember, even that he lied about and covered up. Let's hear Deidre in her own words in deposition.
Okay, now what were you doing that day, morning, around what time was this?
It was around midnight.
Okay. What were you doing?
I was sitting on in my screened-in porch watching Netflix on my Nook.
Okay. This is in April, so it wasn't quite hot yet, right?
No, it was warm.
Yeah. April. Okay. And what brought your attention to what was going on?
The sounds. At first, I heard muffled sounds. They were kind of odd. They sounded like someone who can't talk very well.
Okay. So the sound you heard...
It was language. It was the English language. It sounded like someone with a speech impediment.
Okay. So it wasn't a result of something happening to the person. It just sounded like their speech?
Yes.
Okay. You understand what I'm saying,
And
right?
yes,
Okay.
and that happened before anything. And we have a couple of handicapped kids that live in the neighborhood, and I thought one of them might have wandered out.
Okay.
And they didn't want to go home.
Okay.
So I let it pass.
Okay. Did it sound like anyone was in distress at that point, or did it just sound like the speech impediment to you?
No, it sounded like they could be in distress.
Okay.
It was agitated.
Okay. So agitated speech, but with an impediment.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. What else did you first notice, or what transpired next?
That was the two sounds I heard.
Okay.
The next thing I heard that made me jump out of my chair was I heard a thud. It literally sounded like a person being hit with a bat. It was a really sickening sound. I can't get it out of my mind. It was a horrible sound.
It's sticking with you, that sound.
Yep. Yes.
That's fine. Yep, it's fine. You're fine. Did you see anybody get hit with an object, or what you believe to be an object? Did you see that happen?
That first time, no.
Okay.
Deidre makes it clear that she does not see how it starts, but she does make it quite clear that she hears it. She does not hear any sounds relating to someone being run off the road, because Dan was not. He pulled over and parked. Deidre does not hear Chris declaring to Dan, "You're dead, mother effer," because Chris never said any such thing. Dan hid alongside Chris's van, then sprayed him. Chris immediately covered his face with both hands, demanding Dan stop. This is the first thing Deidre heard: Chris being sprayed and covering his face. Deidre describes hearing it as impeded English language, in distress, and agitated. She describes what Chris said happened, not what Dan said happened. As well, Deidre puts a timestamp on the event at 7 minutes, beginning to end. Again, this does not support Dan's version, who describes a fairly quick event, but rather, and yet again, Chris's version. Chris's statement of the events that night most certainly would have fallen into the time frame Deidre gave. Dan's would not. Let's listen.
From beginning to end, from when I got out of the chair till the guy on the ground was getting beaten up and drove away in his golf cart. 7 minutes.
Much, much more took place between Dan and Chris than Dan said, and Deidre's timestamp yet again supports Chris's version, not Dan's. Dan's yelling for help was only after Chris luckily gained the upper hand. But as strange as it may sound, Dan really did not want any help. As Dan was yelling, he was still fighting, even though he was now on his back. In both her statement that night and in her deposition, Deidre confirms that Dan seemed to be dishonest in his pleas for help. Clearly, Dan puts forth that night he wanted help, but when help arrives, he wants no part of it at all and flees. Let's listen.
To his van, the other guy said, "Oh, I'm bleeding, somebody help me, call the police." And I said, "Okay, I'm calling the police." And he said no, and got back into his golf cart and headed south, yelling Toby, Toby, and something about wanting to break the whole house down or something.
Break the whole house down? What do you mean by that?
Yes, or destroy the house, knock the house down. He had, it looked like a thin, long metal piece he picked up and had it with him when he took off in the golf cart.
He drove away like a normal person doing the speed limit, no big deal. The man on the ground continued to yell, "Help me," and something about Toby again. And I'm bleeding out my head. And I said, "Hold on, the police are coming." And the next thing I knew, he got up, got in the golf cart, and I'm still yelling, "Stop, wait, somebody's coming to help you." and he drove off in the direction of the van. And then he yelled, "Toby, man, look what they did to me."
So who was he talking to?
There was, outside of me and the neighbor across the street, that was it.
So did he get up when you said that the cops were coming? Is that when he got up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm like, the police are coming, to stay there. And he got up and got in the golf cart and drove away. And yelled, "Toby, man, look what they did to me."
Did that seem odd to you?
Very. He went from 1 minute bleeding out.
When you say bleeding out, that's what he was saying?
That's what he said, yes.
Okay.
I'm bleeding out my head, and I'm telling him to stop, and he just gets up and he goes.
That's when he heard the police were coming?
Yeah.
Dan wants no part of the police, as he just attacked Chris with a club. What is most notable is Dan yelling, "I'm going to tear his house down," as he flees. He's talking about Chris's house. As Chris has always put forth that Dan for months prior had been damaging Chris's vehicle repeatedly, Dan now plans on damaging Chris's home. Dan simply would not stay away from Chris's vehicle, and now Dan plans on destroying his home. And Dan means it. Dan paints Chris as not staying away from him, but the truth is, Dan was the one causing all the trouble leading up to this event. And even after Chris confronts Dan, and Dan sneakily sprays and beats Chris with a club, and Chris luckily gets the upper hand in the ordeal and is forced to strike Dan to try to control the situation and Dan's assault, Dan still intends to harass and damage Chris's property. This is who Dan really is, a sneaky, lying, violent drug addict who believes he can do anything to anyone. A very heated conversation was had between Chris and Dan's sister, Val, that night, about what happened and about Dan. This conversation was recorded and is in part in evidence. Val admits Dan brags openly about vandalizing Chris's vehicle, and she admits she had told Chris prior he was doing so. Val as well clearly states her brother Dan is a bully. Val then tells Chris he should have used his fists, as Chris describes to her Dan spraying him, then clubbing him. Dan never intended to involve police, and only did so after he returned to the scene hours later and was forced to by them. As we now know, Dan sprayed and then clubbed Chris and lied about it. Chris then was forced to fight back. As we now know, Dan sprayed and then clubbed Chris and lied about it. Chris then was forced to fight back or get beaten, possibly to death. We now know Chris bit Dan's hand to release the club. Chris then retreated to his vehicle and Dan chased. Chris produced a pipe then and only then, and Dan grabbed onto it, just like he said in his second version he did. Then they fought and Chris got the upper hand. Then the witness Deidre came out and her presence stopped Dan from still fighting. Chris broke free, got up, and Dan, still holding on to Chris, ripped his shirt in half as Chris made it back to his van, safely this time, and left. Chris knew Dan would still harass him, and Dan's language of destroying Chris's home as he fled the scene is proof of that. Chris then told Val, knowing she would tell Dan, that even though he had sprayed and beaten Chris, Chris is still bigger and stronger. And no matter what Dan thinks, Chris will always protect himself no matter what Dan uses on him, and Dan will never, ever sneakily beat him down. Chris then tells Val, Dan is lucky, and Chris in this interaction clearly states to her that he got the pipe when he went back to his van. Chris clearly states to Val, the pipe came into play when he went back to his van, after he was sprayed and beaten by Dan. After Chris fought back and got the club from him and threw it rather than use it on him, after Dan's first attack.
Leave my shit alone, stop putting nails in my fucking tire, like you told
up a bag saying you put screws under his van, and he was pedaling a bike later. I said, so are you not telling people that?
Does he bully you?
Yeah, all the time.
Do I bully you?
No.
Okay, am I the fucking bully? Lucky. When I went back in my car, I had a choice between a K-bar, a machete, which is very sharp, and a metal pipe. I had a choice of the three. He got the metal pipe.
That's the first thing I said to him. I said, what did you do, Danny? I didn't do nothing. He bullies people, and you know what? You don't have to hit him with a stick. You can pound him.
Are you listening to me? The guy came at me with mace in one hand.
I'm going to go confront him.
And then he grabbed the hockey stick.
I'm going to go
Val clearly states her brother Dan threatens Chris, and that Chris isn't doing anything to Dan. She states that Dan is a bully and bullies her all the time, as well as Dan bragging about putting screws into Chris's tires. Also, Dan's declaration in front of the witness Deidre of now tearing Chris's house down as he fled the scene shows his future harassment. There is no evidence Dan was run off the road, because he was not. He stopped because he had a plan to spray and club Chris. Chris directed Dan to pull over that night so Chris could confront him about vandalizing his van and for it to stop. Not to have some kind of street fight on the side of the road. That was Dan's plan. There is no evidence of Chris stating, "You're dead, mother effer," but Deidre's testimony does establish greatly that it was never uttered. There is no evidence Chris came at Dan with a pipe at the outset, and not once did Chris say he did, because, well, he didn't. One has to trust and believe Dan that, number 1, he was run off the road, number 2, Chris approached with a pipe, and number 3, Chris said, "You're dead." And to believe these 3 things, one has to ignore what the witness heard and saw. One has to ignore Dan's being caught repeatedly in his own lies and accept Dan's position that he is just a little innocent guy. Chris was charged with biting and beating Dan with a pipe as he just balled up. But we now know it was Dan who blinded and then clubbed a blinded Chris from the very outset.
I just drove off the side of the road into a grassy, I guess, somebody's backyard.
So I pulled over and he got out. I'll admit, man, I did spray him with bee killer.
The insecticide, where did you spray him at the face?
Yeah, I should have just gotten out of there then, you know, because I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done, but I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there. I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there. So I'm a little guy, man. I do admit I did spray him with bee killer because I was afraid for my life. He told me he was going to kill me.
Okay.
All right. And then he grabbed me and he just beat the shit out of me. He bit me in my finger. And then he just beat me in my head with a pipe, man. I just balled up, really.
Now the walking stick. Did you use that when you were...
Yes, I did, because the bee killer didn't stop and he was still coming at me.
I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done, but...
When did you pick up the stick?
When he was swinging the pipe at me and the bee killer didn't work.
I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there.
Did you make contact with him, with the stick? Where'd you hit him?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's fine.
It was dark, it was a very heated moment.
Upper body, lower body?
I'm pretty sure upper body.
I did spray him with bee killer because I was afraid for my life. He told me he was going to kill me.
Okay.
All right. And then he grabbed me and he just beat the shit out of me. He bit me in my finger. And then he just beat me in my head with a pipe, man. I just balled up, really.
We're going in chronological order here.
Okay.
And then you got the wasp killer. That's when you sprayed him because of the threats, you said, right?
Correct.
And that's also when you struck him with the stick.
Correct.
Okay.
Because the bee killer had, like, 0 effect on him.
I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there.
You struck him with the stick.
Correct.
Okay.
Because the bee killer had, like, 0 effect on him.
I had him a little bit blinded.
The bee killer had, like, 0 effect on him.
Blinded.
0 effect.
Blinded.
0 effect.
Blinded.
0 effect.
Blinded.
0 effect.
Did you have on a blue hat that night?
No, I did not. I don't wear hats.
Okay. Just police collected a hat, so I wasn't sure whose hat it was.
Yeah, I believe it was his, Christopher's.
And the wood stick that they collected, is that the walking stick that you're describing?
Yes, that's correct.
He should have got out of there, and he just wanted to whack you one more time just to let you, know that, he got the best of you or some shit. It was on the lines of that he knew, but he knew he should have got out of there after, but he just wanted to get you one more time, or something like that. That's what, how he put it. He stuck around and wanted to fucking hit you.
Yeah,
one,
he grabbed
one
the
or two
club
more fucking times.
when I was blind.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what didn't he say
That's
that
what
to
it
you?
is. Yeah,
Did he
he
say that?
mentioned something about it. Toby was there, Toby's girlfriend was there, my aunt was there. Everybody was sitting there, and I have no reason to lie, dude. So, if you're wide and you fucking listen to that, well, that's my testimony.
He bullies people, and you don't have to hit him with a stick. You can pound him.
Are you listening to me? The guy came at me with mace in one hand.
I'm going to go confront him.
And then he grabbed a hockey stick.
I'm going to go confront him. He's a bully. I said, he hasn't done nothing to you. You're running around barefoot bag saying you put screws under his van, and he was pedaling a bike later. I said, so are you not telling people that?
Does he bully you?
Yeah, all the time.
Do I bully you?
No.
Okay, am I the fucking bully?
What you do to him? He goes, I didn't touch him. I go, well, you're threatening him all the time.
Leave my shit alone, stop putting nails in my fucking tire, like you told me he was doing?
Well, I don't need you to say that.
Well, that's what you told me.
I told you, put it under you.
We're going in chronological order here.
Okay.
And then you got the wasp killer. That's when you sprayed him because of the threats, you said, right?
Correct.
And that's also when you struck him with the stick.
Correct.
Okay.
Because the bee killer had, zero effect on him.
I should have just gotten out of there then, because I had him a little bit blinded, so I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done, but...
Okay.
So I could have gotten the heck out of there, and that's what I probably should have done, but...
Okay.
That's what I probably should have done, but...
Okay.